Hi, and welcome to episode 157 of the 4Ps. And it was 90 degrees here in New York this past weekend, and with summer on the horizon, COVID on the run, my son and I just started talking about and planning a summer road trip for the week that he has off in between regular camp and his golf camp. Where do we go? What do we see? Who do we visit? The 4Ps. Professional. Political. Practical. Personal. We'd initially discussed a cross-country, partial baseball stadium road trip jaunt, and we were able to map a route between New York and Chicago with a different game in a different city each day, each night, with actually less than only 250 miles of driving per day. It was perfectly mapped out, but it felt ambitious. So, inspired by his fourth grade history curriculum and his newfound Revolutionary War fascination, we're going up to New England, probably in late July. So if you've got any must-see spots or suggestions along the way, in case anything has changed in New England since I was last in Boston 18 months ago, please feel free to share. And in exchange for your road trip tips for keeping a 10-year-old boy engaged, enjoy these 4 Ps. Something personal. As some of you reading this have made the leap, others have stayed put. But ever since we moved out from New York City to the suburbs nearly 8 years ago now, we've loved so many things about our community. We've made great friends. We've joined a local pool and golf club. Our kids have had great teachers and a good school system. We rallied successfully to get our kids back in school during COVID and actively campaigned, also successfully, for our friend's recent Board of Education run. The only complaint, maybe besides Long Island Railroad commuting challenges, has been one nasty neighbor who lived directly across the street from us. I have too many stories to share here about why she's terrible, but take my word for it that she's just not a good person and a worse neighbor. Fortunately, we've had great neighbors all around us overall. There was some initial turnover within that first year or two when we first arrived, with older families and empty nest couples selling to young families with children, around the same age as ours, which has been great. But things really settled down over the past 5 years, and we've all gotten to know each other and spend a lot of quality time with each other, with the exception of ongoing issues between this one woman and both the older and the newer neighbors alike, up and down our street. So imagine our excitement when we saw her house listed for sale earlier this year. As prospective buyers came to look, that anticipation started to grow. Then it happened. We watched excitedly from the window as movers packed up the truck. We counted the days until the closing. On that day, our other neighbors actually blared "Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead" from The Wizard of Oz as her car drove away for the last time. And in celebration of her finally moving away this past weekend, we even had a mini block party the night she left town. We met the new homeowners. They're great, a young couple who will also, at some point soon, hopefully be starting a family. And we feel quite fortunate for the upgrade. May not be the best lessons to teach our kids in terms of celebrating someone leaving. So let's just hope others on our street don't secretly feel this way about us. Something practical. A book that was published earlier this year called Human Hacking has been on my list of things to read now for the past few months. Finally got around to it over the last week or so. It was written as a guide to the art of ethical social engineering and outlines the same tools of psychology and influence deployed by security hackers and demonstrates how to boost social interactions in and throughout our daily lives. Authors Christopher Hadnagy and Seth Shulman covered a range of tips on how to adjust your natural communication tendencies to steer encounters to your advantage, practical tools on how to influence others using empathy, compassion, just social and situational awareness. So I'm going to share with you a few of the key takeaways and lessons from the book. First is to set out to exert influence on people with their best interests in mind. When you apply social engineering ethically, it enables others to feel happier about themselves by giving you what you want and giving them what they want. It's a win-win situation. Keep the human hacking code of ethics in mind when you're interacting with other people, which asks that you, me, we, pledge to leave others better off for having met you in every interaction. So we employ these tactics with compassion, not for the sake of manipulation, but for the sake of common good. Before you can influence others, you have to be able to hack yourself. And the authors recommend an old favorite tool of mine learned a decade ago, but goes back even further than that, which is DISC, D-I-S-C, the 4-quadrant circle. A lot of you who've done professional and management engineering, coaching, training, you understand it. But DISC divides people into 4 distinct types. Dominants, D, like me, are usually confident and results-oriented. I, influencers, tend to be enthusiastic collaborators. The S's are the sincere types and often calm and supportive. And then C is conscientious. These are the types of people who are primarily organized, factual, methodical in the way that they deal with things. Knowing roughly where you fall is especially helpful for identifying points at which your primary communication tendencies work to your advantage and to your disadvantage. Then once you have a grasp on your own tendencies, you can make DISC assessments of other people important in your life. Next is to create effective pretexts to skew conversations to your advantage. How often do people put something on your calendar without any context, like meeting tomorrow? Or someone sends an email and being like, I really need to talk to you. And you're like, oh my God, what's this going to be about? We tend to assume the worst. So creating effective pretexts helps us understand. It involves considering other people's needs, right? So we don't want to do that to others. We don't want people doing that to us. So we call that pretexting. There's actually in the book a 7-step framework that's easy to remember with an acronym, but I already forgot it. So when you read the book, you can remind me. Next tip, build rapport with others and motivate them to agree to your requests. Since most social situations have natural time constraints, it's important to learn how to build rapport quickly in the course of a first encounter. Right? Establishing rapport is powerful because it involves the release of oxytocin. We kind of get excited. Oxytocin, we know, is the hormone that researchers think is tied to many things, but even trust and generosity. So a good place to start building rapport is by offering personal information about yourself. People can then relate to it, and you develop a core foundation for a relationship. Another tip, learning to read and display nonverbal cues can tip the balance of communication in your favor. When you're conversing with people, it's helpful to keep track of whether or not they're feeling comfortable with the situation as you go along by cluing into those nonverbal clues. Like doing so immediately, right? It provides valuable information to help boost rapport and build relationships. Whether it's a stranger or someone you know well, watch the person for like 20 to 30 seconds if possible, just to get a sense how comfortable they are. Are they leaning in? Are they leaning out? What are their facial expressions? That's long enough to pick up on key signals. But not so long. Don't do it too long so that it becomes awkward. And then the last tip is boost listening skills by posing reflexive and reflective questions. So what does that mean? This works by repeating the last 3 or 4 words someone says and then posing them as a question. Not only does that help keep someone talking about the topic that they're obviously engaged in or passionate about, but it also challenges yourself, to pose reflective questions. It's going to help you build the habit of listening more actively in a conversation. Something professional. And it's been a while since I've talked about Snapchat, now more corporately known as Snap. But it's not because I haven't been thinking about them lately. I've been thinking about them a lot. And Snap just hosted its partner summit last week, and disclaimer, I am also a Snap stock shareholder. It's one of the few social media tech platform stocks that I actually own in my portfolio because I believe so much in its upside. There are a number of features, capabilities, updates, things to share, and I'm going to spotlight just a few of them now. Number one was Spotlight. Spotlight was a feature that Snapchat introduced late in 2020, and it's been wildly successful. It's a dedicated tab in the Snapchat app, right? It's the last tab on the right, for promoting short viral videos from the Snapchat community, much like how TikTok videos look and feel. But Spotlight videos don't have a comment section, and other users aren't able to display the name unless you're over 18 and older and have a public profile. So it's very much about showcasing, spotlighting content. Spotlight's gained significant traction and now have over 125 million monthly average users, despite being launched just 6 months ago. The number of viewers who watch over 10 minutes per day grew 70% from January to March. That's crazy. So with all the success that Snapchat has had, they're also adding a number of other tools now to support creators. Story Studio is a new app where creators can make professional quality content and share it directly to Snapchat. The company is also introducing Story Replies, in which fans can respond to creator content, converse with them, and even give gifts. Right? It's a new monetization feature for both Snap and the creators themselves that other platforms are starting. Twitter's also introducing something similar. The strong creator support should result in even better content, attracting more and more viewership within Spotlight. Now, I'll admit that I've never been a huge user of Snapchat, mostly because of its UI and UX. It's the first app that I downloaded a few years ago that made me feel old, like I was missing something. Like I just didn't intuitively in my brain get the flow, right? They've ignored some of my feedback, but they've actually listened to some of the beneficial suggestions, and I appreciate that. It's the mark of a good company. So here are the few most recent things that they've just added and talked about. First is connected lenses, which allow friends to interact on the same lens in real time, right? Augmented reality is one of Snap's biggest long-term opportunities, and these upgrades are betting on AR technology as a larger piece of Snapchat's future experience. Games and minis are cool social experiences, easy to use and quite engaging compared to some other social media players. Ads and tokens allow partners to generate revenue through games, and minis are a great feature for e-commerce partners. And with 200 million plus users over the last 2 years, Snap's making games and minis a more crucial part of the app by giving them a more prominent placement, right? One swipe down from the main camera screen. Next, they're moving the scan button, which searches lenses, to the forefront by adding new functionality to the main camera screen. They're also adding more categories of intelligence, like fashion and food and other culturally relevant topics. Screen Shop, not to be confused with Screenshot, but Screen Shop gives shopping recommendations when a user scans an outfit, a look, or a recipe, right? And gives recommendations when a user is looking at those things, maybe even giving more information or ingredients. Different camera shortcut suggestions, which suggest different camera modes, lenses, sound tricks, and more based on what the user is looking for, also new. And the launch of Lens Studio 4.0 adds new advanced tools for lens creation. Snap is one of, if not the most, innovative digital platforms around. The creativity and features of the product are quite unique. They're fun, they're user-friendly. The future of Snapchat's growth requires expansion and adoption beyond its core user base. And we're seeing increased penetration with older demographics. And as we've seen with TikTok, this trend can be a windfall for growth and revenue, profit. Google's long been mentioned as a potential buyer of Twitter, and now we're starting to hear them being mentioned as a potential buyer in the same conversations with Snap. Who knows? Never happened with Twitter, But for Google, it could certainly make many of us forget that its last social platform experiment, Google Plus, ever existed. And something political. Despite my best efforts to avoid them, which I've talked about, I occasionally still stumble across a thread of posts or tweets or comments or replies in response to the news du jour. And these comments from right-wing faithful still scare me, but also motivate me. The limited exposure helps keep my anxiety levels somewhat lower, but even those consistent tropes and themes are on the far extreme end of rationality and need to be discussed. What's more surprising is that the splits are increasingly occurring along financial and intellectual lines. Working classes are increasingly turning to fascism as a way out of the trap of globalism and modernity that scares them. They used to be a reliable political and social base for the left, or even the middle. But increasingly, the working class has become more conservative, moving to and voting harder to the right. But not even just conservative, right? In any ordinary sense. I'm talking ultra-conservative. Gone are the days of pragmatic, cost-cutting, and lower tax issues at the core of the Republican and GOP base. Now we have completely malicious, ideological, corrupt, and fanatical views that make up the core foundation. The working class once opposed all of these things, and now they embrace it. Trumpism, Brexitism are manifestations of these trends, and they are moored in xenophobia, bigotry, rage, resentment, disinformation, lies, and outright stupidity. And that in turn has given way to the breathtaking corruption and sizable incompetence and venality of Republican Party leaders. You'd think the working class would be upset by this, but it's not the case. The factory worker or farmer who voted for Trump is going broke, can't support his family, and still doesn't grasp that Trump's lies over the last 4 years made him the mark, the target for this deception. The low-level professional who aspires to become middle class, yet who now has to pay for education or retirement and worry about healthcare and so on, yet they keep voting ever more conservative. It doesn't make sense. Biden's victory in November was equated as a way of connecting with support for working class. But the data shows that that's not where his victory came from, at least not in a unified, consistent, block-based way. Biden was put in office by a multitude of minorities from diverse backgrounds, Asians, black people, most Latinos here and there. The fractured white working class has moved to become more fanatically conservative. The poorer Americans are, the more likely they are to vote Republican, against their own self-interest. Instead of having public health care, education, retirement, a higher minimum wage, everything was to be privately provided under conservative mantra. Prices rose astronomically as a result, and here we are in debt as a country again. The average American lives and dies in perpetual debt. This was the way that the Weimar Republic turned into a Nazi state. Germany couldn't repay its debts after World War I. A massive depression set in. The average person's life fell apart, and they turned to embrace fascism. The Nazis blamed the woes of the average German on minorities. Jews, Catholics, Poles. The Nazis are a great example of how manipulation can turn the average working class citizen into that mark. Republicans are doing the same thing, giving people who are breaking down mentally, socially, culturally, economically, spiritually, giving them a scapegoat. Under Trump, the white working class responded in an explosion of fanatical adulation, which allowed Trump to build a cult. He used that cult of personality and the working class's undying devotion to him to purge the Republican Party of anyone that stood in the way. Enter the next stage of the cycle of collapse, which is going to hit the working class hardest. This working class has made its choice. and its choices for xenophobia, rage, the ugliness, the stupidity that I was talking about. And hate. Give them someone to hate, and it seems that they will reward you by turning a blind eye to everything else. Their own lives falling apart, their own exploitation and ruin, their own dehumanization and commoditization as mere disposable cogs in a machine of profit. A modern society cannot function when a working class's only political and social and cultural priority is to have someone to hate. It doesn't work. It doesn't work when there's someone who's made a scapegoat to blame for their woes. That's how civilization falls apart. A working class whose only care in the world is slaking its thirst for hate cannot be a linchpin for functioning society, because it will not demand a working social contract. Economies in which gains are fairly shared. Cultures in which lives have inherent worth and dignity. It's not just the money that matters. Progressives believe in progress. So when it's not just modernity at stake, regression begins to set in. Modernity rewinds. It goes backwards in time. We revert back to the hateful patterns of our past. So now the lines are being drawn again. And the question is, can they be undrawn?